It began not with a question, but with a cutoff. Stephen Miller's voice sliced through the air before Jasmine Crockett could finish her thought. His words weren't sharp with logic. They were sharp with dismissal, the kind of tone that dared her to sit down, to shrink. But she didn't. She held her place, her voice steady, the one heard for the moment. The moderator blinked, frozen mid-turn. The audience shifted in their seats, a collective unease rippling through the hall. Crockett had barely formed her second sentence when Miller lunged again, talking over her as if volume alone could erase her presence. A few murmurs in the crowd carried forward disbelief, irritation, the recognition that something far bigger than a policy debate was about to unfold. By the third interruption, the theater of the moment was undeniable. This wasn't discourse, it was dominance play. Miller leaned back with a smug tilt of his chin, punctuating his words with dismissive hand gestures, cutting her off again and again. He wasn't arguing a point. He was performing a silencing act, one learned from years of wielding arrogance as a weapon. The fourth time, Crockett's lips pressed together, her eyes locked on him not with rage, but with that patient fire she carried like armor. By the fifth, a section of the crowd hissed, the tension breaking into audible protest. And when the sixth interruption came, Miller, once more riding over her voice as though his alone, carried authority. The moderator's weak call for order barely registered. Crockett still hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't slammed her fist or snapped back. Instead, she leaned ever so slightly forward, her gaze cutting through the noise, her presence growing louder than any shout. The audience could feel it, the calm before the storm. 6 times she had been silenced. 6 times her words had been swallowed in arrogance. The silence she allowed to hang after that 6th attack wasn't weakness. It was strategy. The stillness became unbearable, the weight of it pressing down on every person in the room, forcing them to anticipate what would come next, and then, with the faintest smile, tugging at her lips. Jasmine Crockett drew a breath, lifted her chin, and spoke the line that no one, least of all, Stephen Miller, was ready for. No. One was ready for what she said the 7th time. The debate had been promoted for weeks. Billed as one of the most important political exchanges of the year. Immigration, democracy, the very identity of America, these weren't abstract questions. They were the beating heart of the nation's most volatile arguments. On one side of the stage stood Stephen Miller, remembered as the chief architect of Trump-era immigration policies, the strategist who crafted bans, walls, and family separations into legislative form. His reputation wasn't one of compromise, but of calculation, of wielding fear like a scalpel to reshape the country's soul. On the other side, Jasmine Crockett carried herself with the resolve of someone who knew that silence could never be an option. A civil rights attorney, a congresswoman, a voice rising from a lineage of people too often ignored or erased, she entered that stage not as a guest, but as a guardian. To her, this wasn't just policy talk, it was the continuation of a centuries-old struggle for dignity, belonging, and the right to be seen as fully American. The clash between them was never going to be polite. It wasn't designed to be, because behind the questions of visas and asylum lay a far deeper divide. Whether America was a fortress built to keep people out or a promise built to bring people in. By the time Miller had interrupted Crockett 6 times, the tension had surpassed policy. It had become personal, not only for her, but for every person watching who had ever been dismissed mid-sentence, told they didn't belong, or treated as though their story was too inconvenient to hear. The interruptions weren't about debate, they were about dominance. Everyone watching could feel it. The moderator attempted neutrality, but neutrality in that moment felt like complicity. The cameras caught every twitch of Miller's smirk. Every moment Crockett's lips parted only to be overrun by his voice. This was more than a spectacle. It was a test. The audience wasn't just weighing arguments about immigration reform, they were measuring which vision of America they believed in. Because here was the contrast laid bare. Miller, with a cold authority of power exercised from behind closed doors, speaking in absolutes that framed immigrants as burdens, as threats. And Crockett, her presence steady, her voice calm even when silenced, carrying the weight of a truth that couldn't be drowned out forever. Viewers across the country sat on the edge of their couches. They knew something was coming, a clash like. This couldn't end in silence, it demanded an answer. And the longer Crockett held back, the more the suspense grew. Was she waiting for the right moment to strike? Was she choosing not to lower herself to his level? The uncertainty made the atmosphere electric. This wasn't about two politicians trading barbs. This was about the moral core of America being contested in real time. Would the night belong to the man who embodied exclusion, or to the woman who insisted that justice, compassion, and dignity were the true backbone of democracy? Every camera lens, every microphone, every watchful eye in the room was drawn to Crockett as the silence deepened after Miller's sixth interruption. It was no longer about whether she would respond, was about how. And it was clear, one single sentence was about to define the night, and perhaps, just perhaps, the year Stephen Miller's reputation was not built on charm or compromise. It was forged in the crucible of confrontation.
How long before this night?
Before the bright studio lights and the ticking silence of a national audience, Miller had cultivated a career of disruption. First as a speechwriter, then as a policy architect, and eventually as one of the most combative strategists in modern politics. His defining trait had been a refusal to concede, even for a breath. In the Trump White House, Miller had been the architect behind the harshest immigration measures in a generation. Travel bans that targeted entire nations. Push for walls that split deserts and families alike. Policies that turned asylum into an obstacle course few could survive. He didn't shy away from controversy. He courted it. To Miller, outrage. It wasn't a consequence, it was currency. And with each headline declaring his ideas radical or cruel, his smile only seemed to widen. On stage, that same smile played across his lips as if the debate were less about dialogue and more about dominance. He wielded interruptions like weapons. Each time Crockett began to build a point, his voice sliced in, sharp, insistent, loud enough to draw attention, loud enough to drown her out. 6 times he did it. 6 times he stole the floor, his finger jabbing the air like a gavel, punctuating. His defiance with gestures meant to underscore authority. For Miller, the tactic was tried and true. He had spent years in Washington boardrooms and briefing rooms, interrupting, talking over, belittling, and outlasting anyone who challenged him. He wore arrogance like armor. Every smirk, every dismissive shake of his head sent the message. Your words don't matter. It's only mine do. But arrogance has a cost. As the minutes ticked on, the studio audience began to shift in their seats. At first, his interruptions drew polite chuckles from his supporters, but repetition turned chuckles into unease. By the 5th and 6th time, the balance began to shift. What once looked like confidence now read as bullying, what once appeared sharp now felt grating. And while Miller thought he was demonstrating control, what he was really doing was planting the seeds of his own unraveling. The audience's patience was thinning. Cameras caught the subtle shake of heads, the folded arms, the whispered exchanges in the rows behind the moderator. Each interruption chipped away at his credibility. Instead of exposing weakness in his opponent, he was revealing insecurity in himself. But Miller couldn't see it. He was too deep in the performance of power. For years, he had thrived on being the man who could not be rattled, a strategist who could twist any debate into a confrontation on his terms. And tonight, he believed the formula would work once again. He would smirk. He would jab his finger in the air. He would talk over Crockett until her words dissolved into silence. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. For every moment Miller inserted himself, Crockett's composure became sharper, more striking. Her stillness became louder than his voice. The audience began to sense it. They weren't just watching a debate anymore. They were watching a slow-motion unraveling. A man so convinced of his invincibility that he couldn't see the ground, eroding beneath him. That was the paradox of Miller's style. The harder he pressed, the more brittle he appeared. The more he interrupted, the more obvious it became that he feared what might be said if he didn't. And in that gap between arrogance and fear, between dominance and insecurity, lay the vulnerability he had spent his career trying to hide. Arrogance was familiar. America had seen it before in press conferences, where he dismissed reporters with icy disdain. In policy briefings, where he declared humanitarian concerns irrelevant. In speeches, where his rhetoric painted compassion as weakness. His tactic was always the same: overwhelm, overpower, outlast. But arrogance has one fatal flaw. Eventually it meets someone who refuses to bend. The cameras zoomed closer. Miller's expression, once so smug, now carried the faintest hint of strain. His interruptions were faster, more desperate, as though he sensed the shift and tried to smother it before it spread. His finger jabbed the air again, punctuating his words, but this time it didn't land with authority. It landed with irritation. The audience was no longer with him. They were waiting, almost willing, for the moment when the interruptions would backfire. They wanted to see the smirk wiped away, the arrogance punctured, the strategist outmaneuvered by something stronger than tactics, by truth itself. And that was the silent current flowing through the room. Miller believed he was in control, but in reality, he had set the stage for his own downfall. His arrogance, his interruptions, his finger jabs, his smirks, they were no longer intimidating. They were exhausting. Everyone was ready for the shift. They just didn't know when it would come. But tonight, arrogance would meet its match. Jasmine Crockett did not rise from privilege or power. She rose from the grind, from the late nights with stacks of case files on her desk, from the days when standing up for the voiceless meant standing alone. Long before she sat beneath the harsh lights of a national debate stage, she was already hardened by battles far more grueling than verbal interruptions. Her roots were in the law, but not the glamorous kind. She wasn't representing corporations or cozying up to elite firms. She chose the kind of law that bled, defending the marginalized, the poor, the unheard. In courtrooms across Texas, Crockett became a shield for those the system too often cast. Aside families facing eviction, workers silenced by discrimination, voters targeted by suppression schemes, she was the voice they couldn't afford, but one who never let them be ignored. In those cramped courtrooms, Crockett discovered the quiet power of composure. Opposing attorneys tried to rattle her with sharp objections and theatrical performances. Judges, skeptical and impatient, sometimes looked down from the bench with dismissive eyes. But Crockett never raised her voice recklessly, never allowed anger to spill uncontrolled. She weaponized calm. Her stillness disarmed aggression. Her steady gaze unnerved opponents who mistook composure for weakness. Her cross-examinations revealed the truth with surgical precision. It wasn't just about winning cases. Her and the communities she represented. Crockett knew what it meant to walk into a room where no one expected her to belong. As a black woman, as a young attorney, as someone unafraid to challenge the powerful, she felt the weight of prejudice and dismissal pressing against her. Every smirk from an opposing counsel, every whispered doubt from a political insider, every headline suggesting she was too bold or too confrontational only sharpened her. Resolved her battles extended beyond the courtroom. When suppression bills swept through legislatures, Crockett stood at the front lines. She wasn't content to fight in back rooms. She took the fight to rallies, to the streets, to the microphones where her words could echo. She spoke not just of policy, but of dignity, of the sacred right to be counted and recognized. And in every speech and every stand, she carried the same composure that had unnerved opponents in court. Calm, fierce, unshakable. It was this history, this crucible of fights for civil rights, that prepared her for the moment with Stephen Miller. He saw interruptions as a strategy. She saw them as familiar. To Miller, silencing her voice was a tactic. To Crockett, it was a daily reality she had faced and defied for years. What he thought would break her was, in fact, the very pressure that had always refined her. There were humanizing moments along the way, moments that revealed not just a fighter, but a woman shaped by empathy. Former clients remembered how she stayed late after hearings to explain rulings in plain language, how she sat with families who had lost everything and reminded them they still had dignity, Colleagues spoke of her ability to balance fire with grace, to hold her ground without ever losing her humanity. She wasn't just an attorney. She was an advocate who carried the weight of her community's hopes. And yet, Crockett wasn't naive. She knew the toll these fights took, the exhaustion of pushing against entrenched systems, the frustration of watching justice bend too slowly, too reluctantly. But she also knew that every struggle carved a deeper well of resilience within her. And resilience, more than rhetoric, was what she carried on to that debate stage. On that night, beneath the unblinking cameras and the smirks of her opponent, Crockett embodied the sum of her battles. Every courtroom interruption had been a rehearsal for Miller's arrogance. Every dismissive glance from those in power had been training for his finger jabs and smug smiles. Every voter she defended against suppression had been another brick in the foundation of her strength. So when Miller interrupted her 6 times, when his voice crashed over hers with the arrogance of someone convinced he could silence her, Crockett did not flinch. She did not break. She leaned into the moment with the same composure that had unnerved countless opponents before. She understood something Miller did not. Silence is not defeat, and composure is not surrender. It is the prelude to precision. The audience, watching closely, sensed it too.
Oh.
They saw in Crockett not just a debater, but a fighter who had been here before, in different forms, against different adversaries. They recognized that what was unfolding on stage was not a mere lash of policy points, but a reflection of deeper struggles. Power against dignity, arrogance against resilience, silencing against truth. Every fight she'd faced prepared her for this moment. Every dismissal, every smirk, every uphill battle had forged the calm that now radiated from her. Miller thought he was in control. He thought the interruptions had thrown her off balance. But the audience could feel that something was building. Behind that composure, something waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. And when it came, it would not be just another line in a debate. It would be the sentence that defined the night, the sentence that defined her, and perhaps the sentence that would echo far beyond the studio walls. Because Crockett wasn't simply defending herself. She was carrying the voices of those who had been silenced for generations. No amount of interruptions could erase that truth. The interruptions weren't enough for Stephen Miller. By the time the moderator regained some semblance of order, Miller shifted tactics. He smiled not warmly, but with the kind of condescension that dripped off every syllable he spoke. "Well, Congresswoman," he began, voice laced with mock politeness, "maybe if you've spent less time playing identity politics and more time understanding what real Americans care about, you'd know this country doesn't want open borders." Gasps rippled across the audience. It wasn't just the insult, it was the smug certainty with which he delivered it. He leaned back in his chair, as though he had just delivered the knockout punch. The air between them thickened. Crockett didn't move. She didn't blink. Her stillness was louder than his words. Miller wasn't finished. He pressed forward, emboldened by the silence. "Tell me, Congresswoman, have you ever once thought about the families of crime victims? The ones who suffer because of your so-called compassion? Or do you only care when it fits your little activist narrative?" A murmur surged through the studio. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered sharp reactions under their breath. The moderator tried to interject, but Miller waved him off, his finger slicing through the air like a gavel. He had the floor, and he wasn't letting go. "And another thing," he said, his voice rising. "You talk about dignity and rights, but what about the dignity of American workers losing jobs to illegal immigrants? What about the rights of citizens who actually built this nation?" He smirked, turning his body halfway toward the crowd, feeding off their discomfort like oxygen. For the first time, Crockett shifted in her chair. Not to lash out, not to react, but to square herself, her posture steady, her gaze fixed on him like stone. She let the words hang. The audience could feel it. A storm gathering in silence. Miller, sensing no immediate retort, mistook composure for weakness. He pushed harder. "You see, folks, this is the problem. People like Congresswoman Crockett want to lecture us about morality, while ignoring the real consequences of their reckless policies. They hide behind scripture, behind slogans, behind identity. But when it comes to real solutions, he shrugged dramatically. Nothing. The arrogance in his tone wasn't just palpable, it was suffocating. Every jab carried the weight of years of insults hurled at women like her, at leaders who dared to challenge his vision of America. The audience could feel the tension winding, tighter and tighter. A man in the front row shook his head. A woman near the back muttered, "Unbelievable." The moderator's pen tapped nervously against his notepad. Crockett remained still. She had learned long ago that sometimes the greatest power wasn't in rushing to speak, but in choosing the perfect moment. And everyone watching knew she was waiting for it. Miller leaned forward now, his tone dripping with patronization. "Go on, Congresswoman. Defend it. Defend the indefensible."
Tell America why criminals deserve more compassion than its citizens.
He smirked again, certain he had backed her into a corner. The silence stretched. The audience leaned in, hanging on the brink of anticipation. Gasps had given way to murmurs to a collective hum of restless energy. Something was about to break. And then Jasmine Crockett moved. She leaned forward, her hands folding calmly on the desk, her eyes locked on Miller with an intensity that froze his smirk in place. The stillness evaporated, replaced with a current of energy so sharp the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. The moment had arrived, and no one, not the moderator, not the audience, not even Stephen Miller himself, was ready for what she was about to say next. The silence stretched on, electric and heavy. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her eyes unwavering, her composure unbroken. Stephen Miller sat across from her, his smirk frozen mid-curve, waiting, perhaps even daring her to respond. The entire debate stage seemed to tilt in that instant. Every breath in the room suspended, the audience collectively perched on the edge of what they somehow knew was about to be a defining moment. And then she spoke. Mr. Miller, Crockett began, her voice calm, even carrying a controlled strength that sliced through the tension like a blade. "You keep talking about criminals and dignity. But let's be clear, America doesn't lose its soul because of who crosses our borders. It loses its soul because of men who believe cruelty is policy." The words landed with a seismic weight. A sharp inhale spread through the crowd, the kind that signals recognition of truth too often buried. Miller blinked, his smirk twitching into something else. He opened his mouth, as if to interject again. But Crockett wasn't finished. She paused just long enough for the silence to harden, for the suspense to thicken him, then she delivered the line that no one in that room would forget. "You interrupt me 6 times to tell America who doesn't belong, but the only thing you've proven tonight is that fear doesn't make you strong, it only makes you loud." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The crowd froze, as though the syllables themselves had stunned the oxygen out of the room. Then it erupted. Gasps, claps, laughter swelling into a roar that shook the studio walls. The moderator's eyes widened, lips parted in shock. The audience leaned forward as though trying to catch every reverberation of her words. Even the camera operators, normally stone-faced professionals, were visibly rattled, their lenses struggling to hold steady as the reaction crescendoed. Miller, the master interrupter, the ever-smirking architect of disruption, sat completely still, his face drained of confidence, his jaw tightening as though to keep from betraying the crack in his armor. His hands, once so quick to jab the air with dismissive certainty, now gripped the edge of the desk just a little too firmly. Crockett wasn't done. She pressed forward, her voice firm but measured, each word carrying the rhythm of a verdict being read. "See, Stephen, this country wasn't built by fear. It was built by families who had nothing but hope, by immigrants who were told they didn't belong but proved they did. And while you talk about dignity as if it's yours to grant, let me remind you, it is not your voice that defines America. It is the voices you keep trying to silence." The crowd thundered again, some standing to their feet, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the audacity of what they were witnessing. The line was not just a counterattack, it was a reversal. courtroom-style takedown that left Miller not just wrong but exposed. The moderator tried to regain control, but his voice was drowned out by the rising tide of applause and shouts. Miller glanced around, his composure fraying, his smirk long gone. He looked smaller now, diminished under the weight of Crockett's calm fire, and then she delivered the coup de grace. The seventh line that sealed the night, 6 times you interrupted me, but here's the truth. You can't interrupt. This country is not yours to close. It belongs to all who believe in its promise. And that's a promise bigger than your fear. Silence fell again, not out of hesitation this time, but reverence. The audience let the words settle, like dust after an explosion, before erupting. Once more in thunderous applause, some laughed through their shock, others clapped until their palms stung. A woman in the front row wiped away tears. A man near the back stood, fists pumping in the air. The camera zoomed in on Miller, his lips pressed tight, his eyes darted, and for the first time all night he had nothing to say. But the man who built his reputation on relentless interruption, on dominating every exchange, now sat muted, shut down not by volume, but by dignity. Crockett leaned back in her chair, serene, composed, the faintest trace of a knowing smile on her lips. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted. She hadn't matched Miller's fury. Instead, she had transformed his interruptions into the setup for his own undoing. The moderator finally found his voice. But it was shaky, almost reluctant, as though even he felt the futility of trying to steer the moment back to normalcy. The debate had tilted irreversibly. A single sentence, delivered with poise and precision, had redefined the night. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because outside the walls of that studio, a nation was watching. Millions at home had witnessed the exchange, had felt the seismic shift when arrogance met its match. Phones were already buzzing. Screenshots, quotes, clips, it was all spilling into the bloodstream of the internet before the applause had even died down. In that studio, Miller sat silent, his armor cracked wide open. But beyond the cameras, the aftershocks were beginning to spread, and no one was ready for how far they would reach. By the time the debate cameras powered down, real battle had already shifted to a different stage, the infinite sprawl of America's screens. Within minutes, Jasmine Crockett's 7th line was clipped, subtitled, and rocketing across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. The phrase, "Fear doesn't make you strong, it only makes you loud," became a rallying cry, plastered on memes, looping on reels. Repeated by influencers and teenagers alike, hashtags exploded like fireworks. Hashtag fear is not strength. Hashtag Crockett 7th line. Hashtag mic drop moment. Each one trending, each one multiplying the reach. The clip was shared not just once, but tens of thousands of times in a single hour. Users added slow motion effects, dramatic soundtracks, even courtroom gavels striking to punctuate the moment. Miller's smirk collapsed. Fox News scrambled to contain it, framing the line as disrespectful and calling Crockett shrill. Yet their very coverage amplified the clip further, ensuring millions more saw it, replayed it, dissected it. CNN framed it as the defining moment of the debate, looping it every 15 minutes. MSNBC leaned in hardest, branding it a masterclass in composure under fire. And then came the voices beyond the pundits. Celebrities chimed in. An Oscar-winning actor tweeted, "That's how you handle a bully, calm, clear, devastating." A famous comedian posted a parody skit reenacting Miller's interruptions, each one cut off by Crockett's 7th line flashing in neon text. Even rival politicians couldn't help themselves, a progressive senator wrote. "That's the America I believe in," a moderate Republican breaking ranks admitted in a podcast. "I don't like her politics, but that was one hell of a takedown." But the reaction didn't stop with politics or entertainment. Pastors from immigrant congregations across the country quoted Crockett's words from their pulpits. "Fear doesn't make you strong," rang out in Sunday services, repurposed as scripture-like wisdom, a modern parable for courage. Civil rights groups adopted it as a slogan for new campaigns, emblazoning it on banners and posters. In classrooms, teachers replayed the clip to spark discussion on democracy, power, and dignity. Meanwhile, Miller became a punchline. Memes showed him with duct tape across his mouth. TikTok teens edited his image into compilations of villains. Silence by heroes. One viral caption read, 6 interruptions, 1 knockout. His smirk, once a weapon, was now a symbol of defeat, looped endlessly in GIF form, as his face froze at the moment the words landed. And yet, behind the laughter and applause, a deeper current surged, because Crockett's line had touched a nerve. Far more profound than political entertainment, it spoke to millions who had been interrupted, silenced, told they didn't belong. 2 immigrants who had been reduced to caricatures in debates, 2 women talked over in boardrooms, 2 students whose voices had been dismissed. It was more than a comeback, it was vindication. Editorials poured in the next morning. The New York Times called it a turning point in the immigration debate. The Washington Post wrote, Crockett reminded America that dignity is not a weapon, but a shield. Even conservative outlets admitted begrudgingly that it was the moment everyone will remember. On late-night shows, comedians replayed the clip to raucous laughter, some even standing and clapping mid-monologue. On college campuses, students mimicked the line during open mics and rallies. A trending TikTok sound used Crockett's voice as the background to countless videos, some playful, each giving her words a new life beyond politics. For Miller, the silence was damning. He avoided interviews in the immediate aftermath, his usual bravado replaced by terse statements from his allies. But the internet had already declared its verdict, and once that tide turns, no spin can stop it. He wasn't just debated, he was diminished, reduced from architect. A feared emblem of its futility. Crockett, meanwhile, tried to keep her composure amid the storm of attention. When asked the next day about the viral moment, she brushed it off with humility. I wasn't trying to go viral. Yet her words continued to ripple outward, quoted in headlines, shared on protest signs, stitched into TikTok reactions, etched into the collective memory of a country hungry for clarity, and still. Even as America laughed, celebrated, and shared, the weight of the moment pressed down in quieter ways. Because beyond the entertainment, beyond the memes, there was an unshakable recognition that this wasn't just about one debate or one line. It was about what kind of country America was becoming, and whether dignity could survive the noise. The hashtags would fade. The memes would be replaced by the next viral joke. But the line delivered with poise in the face of arrogance had lodged itself deeper. It had become part of the ongoing story of who belongs, who defines strength, and who gets the final word. And as the cheers echoed online, one question lingered in the silence left behind. What if this wasn't just a viral moment, but a turning point? Because beneath the laughter, the words carried a much heavier truth. The viral moment might have belonged to the clip, but the deeper meaning belonged to something larger, something older than the stage, older than politics. When Jasmine Crockett finally sat back after delivering her 7th line, what lingered? Wasn't just the silence she left Stephen Miller drowning in, was the resonance of a truth America had been aching to hear. Because at its heart, this wasn't a debate about interruptions or one politician versus another. It was about the meaning of strength, the soul of faith, and the moral compass of a nation. Miller had tried to turn religion into a weapon, quoting scripture not as a guide for justice, but as a cudgel to exclude, to divide, to silence. But Crockett reframed it with one simple, undeniable shift. Morality is not about the volume of your voice or the power you claim over others. It is about the way you treat the vulnerable, the marginalized. It's the ones who cannot fight back. And in that reframing, Crockett connected to something universal. She reached beyond partisan lines, beyond ideology, into the marrow of what people instinctively recognize as just. It didn't matter whether someone in the audience was Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or secular. Her words pointed to a moral truth that transcended all labels. Dignity is strength, compassion is power, justice is faith in action. The brilliance of her moment was not that she humiliated Miller, though many enjoyed that spectacle. It was that she elevated the conversation itself. She reminded America that true faith, when it is lived with integrity, doesn't shrink people down. It lifts people up. It doesn't draw lines to exclude, it builds bridges to include. It doesn't silence voices, it amplifies the cries of the unheard. In a single sentence, Crockett turned a clash of egos into a parable of values. She didn't just shut down a man, she opened up a horizon. Faith, when wielded with integrity, she said, in the aftermath calls us higher. That phrase reverberated just as strongly as the viral line because it captured the essence of what made her presence on that stage so electric. For too long, faith had been framed in politics as control, as fear, as the property of those who shout loudest. Crockett flipped that script and rooted faith in its original soil. Justice, mercy, humility, and love. It was an inversion so complete, it left her opponent not just defeated, but irrelevant. Because while Miller argued for walls, Crockett argued for humanity. While Miller tried to weaponize scripture, Crockett embodied it. While Miller smirked and shouted, Crockett stood steady and dignified, showing that calm truth outlasts even the most aggressive noise. The audience felt it too. What made the moment cathartic wasn't simply that the villain lost it, was that the values so often buried under cynicism rose to the surface, undeniable and triumphant. People who had been told they didn't belong, immigrants, working mothers, marginalized communities, saw themselves reflected in her composure. They saw proof that dignity can outlast disdain, that courage can outshine cruelty. And in the days that followed, that was the thread people carried with them. Not just the laughter at Miller's expense, but the inspiration of Crockett's poise. Her comeback became a mirror in which people could see their own struggles differently every time they had been interrupted, dismissed, or silenced. There was a chance to respond with the same unshakable clarity. In that sense, Crockett's victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to the people who recognized themselves in her stance. It belonged to the vision of an America where strength is not measured in domination, but in compassion. Where morality is not performance but practice. Where faith is not reduced to slogans, but lifted into action. By the time the clip faded from trending charts, its essence had already been woven into something enduring. Crockett's words were no longer just a response in a debate, they were a rallying principle, a reminder, a challenge. Because dignity had triumphed. And in that triumph, America glimpsed what it could be when courage meets integrity. But if dignity had won the night, the question now was whether it could win the future. And that answer, Crockett implied with her calm smile, would depend not on the loudest voices, but on the actions of millions who had just been reminded of their power. Stephen Miller thought he could dominate the stage with arrogance. With 6 relentless interruptions meant to shake his opponent. But Jasmine Crockett showed America something different. With dignity as her armor and truth as her weapon, she endured the noise and waited for her moment. And when the 7th interruption came, she delivered the line that ended the game. Smirk vanished, the room froze, and the balance of power shifted. It wasn't just a debate, it was a story. Story of arrogance meeting its match, of composure crushing chaos, of one voice proving that strength isn't measured in volume, but in vision. The arc was clear. Miller interrupted 6 times. Crockett endured 6 times. And on the 7th, she silenced him forever. That's the power of dignity. That's the power of truth spoken without fear. And that's the power of moments like this moments, where politics turns into parable, where one exchange tells a bigger story about who we are and who we want to be. Here at Viral Insight, we believe in capturing those moments, the clashes that expose hypocrisy, the lines that echo beyond the stage, the voices that remind us of justice, compassion, and the courage it takes to stand tall in the storm. If you felt the electricity of this moment, if you saw yourself reflected in Crockett's poise, if you believe dignity should always outshine arrogance, then this is your movement too. Subscribe to Viral Insight. Share this story. Add your voice to the millions who refuse to be silenced. Because history isn't written by the loudest. Voice it's written by the one that cannot be ignored. And tonight, we all witnessed exactly what that sounds like.